Good morning, and thank you for joining the webinar, Strategies for Effective Rural VR Service Delivery. So before I get started, I want to thank the E3 project for inviting me to present about barriers and strategies related to rural VR service delivery. I'm excited to be here. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Catherine Ipsen, and I've worked at the University of Montana Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities the last 25 years. For the bulk of this time, I've done employment-related research as part of the Research and Training Center on Disability in Rural Communities, or the RTC Rural. I must at this point say that RTC Rural and most of the projects that I've been involved in have been funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehab Research, or NIDLR. So, although I've worked in various domains, including health and independent living, the bulk of my research has focused on employment within the Voc Rehab system. And I plan to share some of the VR-focused research that I've engaged in over the last 15 years in my presentation today. This first slide shows a map of the U.S., and in dark green are the rural or non-core counties. And I just wanted to start off showing this just to show you how vast an area that we're talking about, particularly in states like Montana, North and South Dakota, and so forth, down kind of the center of the U.S. There's just this great vast amounts of rural areas where service delivery looks different in the VR system just based on these distances. I also wanted to share some basic demographics about rural places before we got started. So data on the charts on this slide come from the American Community Survey. The micro, metro, and non-core counties are classified using the Office of Management and Budgeting classifications, where metro counties include at least one urban core of 50,000 or more people. Micro counties include an urban core of 10,000 to 50,000 people. And then non-core counties, where this is the focus of our research, are counties with an urban core population of less than 10,000 people. So there's just not very many services available. They can be characterized by pretty isolated places in certain circumstances. So what these two charts show, the first shows that the disability rate increases from metro to micro to non-core counties. And we've done quite a bit of research on disability in rural places, and we know that the disability rate is higher across all disability types and across all ages. So it's pretty uniform in terms of having a higher rate. It's not just associated with an aging population, etc. The poverty rate is also higher in non-core counties, particularly for people with disabilities. Actually, as this chart shows, 25% of people with disabilities are living at or below the poverty rate. So undoubtedly, this group represents a particular need for effective employment programming. And much of my research has really focused on strategies to do this. So I'm going to set the stage in terms of some of the research that we have engaged in, just to learn more about the rural conditions of VR service delivery. So we've done quite a few projects. One is focused on the consumer experience going through the Voc Rehab program, and we call it the Premature Exit study. It included informant interviews with who were consumers who exited the VR program early. We did a quantitative prospective longitudinal study. That's a lot of words for simply saying we tracked people coming into the VR program and followed them along for 18 months. We've done interviews with a random sample of those exits who left for both good and negative reasons. We've done a state data project, which really focused on RSA 911 case records, as well as VR informant interviews to learn how services were delivered in rural communities. We've done another small study really focused on rural business development strategies. So using all of this information, we've learned some things about what is driving some of the barriers to services in rural areas. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Premature Exit study. We conducted this study because nearly half of all eligible VR consumers drop out of the program before completing services. Looking at some of the RSA 911 data, VR spends approximately $365 million annually to serve these clients who end up dropping out, and this is direct costs as opposed to program costs, which are kind of captured and hard to quantify on a case basis. So that number is likely well below what it actually costs to serve people who drop out. And we also know from some other research conducted by the Research Triangle that premature exits are associated with worse employment and economic outcomes. So as I described briefly before in the last slide, we wanted to track consumers as they entered the VR program and to really quantify and learn about what their experiences were and the things that led to them dropping out of the program or leaving with a successful outcome. So we collected data over time, and we found that almost half of all VR respondents felt that progression through the VR program was too slow. So pacing was a really important aspect to successful case progress. We also found that attachment to the VR program was associated with the number of client counselor contacts, both in person and via phone or email. I'm going to go to the next slide now and talk about some of the reasons that people told us they had exited the program. So approximately a third said that they left because they were satisfied with the services they received. They got a job, they received the services they desired, they felt that they were finished with the program. Another 35% left for very distinct dissatisfied reasons. They said they weren't getting the services they wanted, that VR stopped contacting them, the process was taking too long, and they were having problems with their counselor. Another third have issues that may or may not be associated with VR programming. And these included things like health issues that come up, discouragement with job opportunities in the community, transportation issues, family issues. They didn't want to risk losing benefits. Incarceration was something that impacted some folks. And then unsure about their status in the VR program. So there were some aspects where people were confused about whether they were still in the program or not. These data, as you see on the next slide, are really compounded by the things that we heard from VR informants in terms of their experiences with rural service delivery issues. So one of the things that we learned that was reinforced in the 9/11 or the RSA 9/11 data was that it took more time to get to an individualized plan of employment and placement in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. And we know that faster delivery leads to better attachment to the VR program. And so this time to IPE is a barrier for rural people. We also learned that there was less frequent client-counselor contact, less access to specialists, fewer vendors, and more limited educational and training opportunities. So I want to talk a little bit about the less frequent client-counselor contact. What happens in rural areas is a lot of agencies operate on an itinerant counseling model in rural areas where counselors travel through a specific location on a schedule, but it can be a schedule that is pretty spaced out over time. And if a counselor is passing through a town and a client doesn't happen to be available on that particular day, then they might have to forego a meeting until the next time the counselor is coming through. So those kinds of schedules can put delays in the counseling process. Also, access to specialists and vendors was an issue that I want to expand on a little bit more. Many VR programs, as most of the people on the call probably know, utilize specialists and vendors to deliver job development services and those sorts of things on an ongoing basis in urban areas. They help these people, these vendors and specialists, help the program move forward and services that counselors may not be available or trained to deliver. So this access issue is another delay in the counseling or VR process. Rural employment issues were another thing that was highlighted in the interviews. That while urban areas you can establish a relationship with the business and then place multiple people, it was much harder to establish these kind of business networks in rural areas. Personal communication was very important. If the itinerant counselors weren't in the community or known in the community, it was hard to develop these kinds of relationships. Vendors did not serve the rural community, so there was no one with the community presence that seemed to be needed to establish business connections. Harder to access appropriate training for the rural client. They may not have appropriate training in their location, would need to travel to get that training, and that was an added barrier. Fewer job opportunities, so it was harder to accommodate a client choice. And then another thing that was brought up in some of these interviews was closed doors due to reputation or family history. That in rural areas, once you burn a bridge, it's hard to rebuild it. Whereas in an urban area, you can kind of walk away from one business and walk into another one. So that was an issue, a challenge that was highlighted for sure. So having set the stage of some of the rural barriers, I want to move on to some of our work to develop strategies to improve rural service delivery. For the presentation today, I'm going to talk about 3 strategies. The first is to increase the use of telecommunications, both for counselor-client communication, but also to expand economic opportunity. We're going to also look at expanding rural capacity by looking at strategies to improve vendor availability in rural communities, and then also expanded economic opportunity in terms of rural business development strategies, and also to utilize self-employment more fully as an economic or work outcome. So first we're going to turn to telecom and social media. We found that alternate methods of communication, such as email, text, and video, really do help keep people engaged in services, even if they aren't participating in face-to-face communication. We also know that alternative methods of job exploration are important, and that we have learned that counselors are not very comfortable with these, such as using social media to market yourself or to use social media as a strategy for finding employment. And the barriers that counselors have told us about are based on knowledge and capacity, ethics concerns in terms of how to use different technologies appropriately without violating counseling ethical guidelines, and lack of telecommunications use policies at the VR agency. So we have developed some strategies to help with this, including the Telecom Toolbox and social media policies. And I'm going to just give you a tour of these as a way that you might utilize some of these resources in your own agencies. So first we're going to look at the Telecom Toolbox. And the toolbox has 4 major sections that can be used to expand services and overcome counselor and consumer reluctance and lack of knowledge using online resources. So the Telecom Toolbox is really broken into several sections, including communication, online career development, ethics, and then there's also a blog that has a variety of articles that focus on different online job development strategies and communication strategies. So in the communication area, we really go over the use of email, text, video conferencing, and instant messaging in the context of counseling services and how a counselor might set up those relationships, to talk to the consumer about how often they check email, how the use of those different strategies will unfold in the VR process, to really make sure that it's a good strategy for the consumer and the counselor. In terms of the online career development tab, we spend a lot of time talking about managing your online presence. So the consumer may have things that they've shared online that need to be improved, or some content that may need to be replaced or removed. So we talk about some of those strategies, as well as active job search online. And while this isn't entirely a rural strategy, there's a lot of opportunity for online job search, and it really is how job search is happening for people with and without disabilities all across the U.S. And we found with some of our baseline research that counselors were a little bit behind the game in terms of using this strategy with their counselors, and we really wanted to make sure that they had the tools to do that effectively. Another aspect of the Telecom Toolbox is the ethics section. So the ethics section covers things like using distance communication, using social media, informed consent processes, so that a counselor, if they're worried about using telecommunications, has those options available to them. And then more recently, we've really used blogs as a way to keep up with the changing pace of telecommunications. That is one of the difficulties with exploring this kind of research or conducting this kind of research, is that it's a moving target, and there's always new platforms, new strategies, and new ways of doing business online that we have to continually be thinking about. If you are interested in checking out the Telecom Toolbox, the address is www.telecomtoolbox.org, and it is included at the end of these slides in some of our references. So if you're interested, I welcome you to check it out. Okay, I'm going to now turn to social media policy elements. We did a study looking at various VR policies related to social media, if they had any, and we found very different elements in each policy, but drawing on the literature, we identified 6 aspects that we felt were important to be included in a comprehensive social media policy. And these including the policy scope, so some guidelines about use at both the agency and counselor level. Consumer awareness, so how do you inform clients about risks and benefits of using social media, including risks to their own confidentiality. And this was usually related to how consumers engaged on a VR social media account, not necessarily an account where they've friended a counselor. Acceptable use policies, so agency expectations in terms of how social media is used, how counselors use it to interact with clients, monitoring procedures, and then disciplinary actions if people are using social media inappropriately. An example might be an agency says not to friend a client and a counselor does, and what happens, they may lose their social media privileges at the VR agency. Account management, how the agency and employees create and maintain and close different social media accounts. Confidentiality, and this was a big one, but how the agency and counselor will minimize risk to confidentiality, and then what they will do if a confidentiality breach happens, and what are the steps in place to make sure to minimize that issue. Finally, our ethical guidelines. So what does the agency consider as appropriate postings? And then in terms of professionalism, steps to do no harm. So what are the guidelines that the agency really aspires to share broadly? So interestingly, we coded 22 policies and 1 guideline, and we found that only 2 policies actually included all 6 policy elements in any kind of comprehensive way. And only 1 policy acknowledged the role of social media as a tool for consumer job search. So most of the agency policies are related to how the agency might use a social media account to maybe post about an upcoming job fair or those sorts of things, and really does not address social media as a strategy for engaging in job search, and does not really talk about steps that a counselor might utilize to help a consumer really capitalize on that opportunity in terms of showcasing their skills and applying for jobs. So we were a little bit surprised at the lack of use, and it really confirmed why counselors may not be using social media effectively in consumer job search activities. I'm going to shift gears now, and we're going to really focus in on some research that is some recent work that I've done in terms of vendor availability in rural communities. So we know that most VR agencies utilize vendors to deliver job development services. And when we were interviewing agencies about vendor availability, we found that approximately 50% of agencies had areas in their states that were unserved. And I might add that we interviewed almost half of the VR agencies across the US. So this really represents a good number of agencies and vendor availability for them. So what we found is that when vendors were not available in a particular area, say a rural community, VR counselors were typically asked to provide those services, or clients really didn't receive services, that there weren't services available. This introduced delays in services sometimes due to itinerant schedules and reduced opportunities for community connections, where a vendor often spends time in communities to develop relationships with business owners, etc. So lack of vendor availability was really identified as an issue. When we interviewed agencies about how they paid vendors, we learned that approximately 80% of agencies use a model called results-based funding. And results-based funding is something where vendors receive a set fee for meeting a certain milestone. Let's say it's job placement or 30 days on the job. Results-based funding really was a model that came to attention in the early 2000s, and it was a way to get to outcomes more quickly. VR agencies were feeling like consumers were languishing in services, vendors were continuing to bill for hours without any kind of foreseeable progress in the case. And so results-based funding really was meant to incentivize getting people on the job more quickly. And based on our research in terms of pace of delivery services, this isn't a bad thing. And what we do find is that it does result in higher rates of competitive employment and lower overall costs as vendors are incentivized to move cases forward. One thing about results-based funding, however, is that it shifts financial risk from the agency to the vendor. That the agency is only paying for results and the vendor is only getting paid for results, and so it essentially, a vendor can make a lot of money if they do their job very well and get people placed quickly, and they'll make not as much money if they aren't as effective in meeting those benchmarks. The payments are based on average costs, and there's a mechanism where agencies will figure out how much on average it costs to get a person to employment, and they will set their rates based on that average cost, whereas people that take longer, the vendor will get paid a lower rate, and people that are easier to place, the vendor will receive a higher rate. And then overall, in general, the idea is that vendors will get paid a fair amount on their caseload or their total caseload. One problem with results-based funding is that it can undermine rural vendor availability, and we found this to be true, that states that utilize results-based funding had very significant areas that vendors weren't available in rural communities. And the problem relates to the case costs in rural areas are generally higher. It takes time and money to travel to rural places. There's fewer job opportunities, so getting a client to placement might take longer. There's no economies of scale, and by this I mean in an urban area, I might have a relationship with Walmart or Microsoft or some other big company where I can place multiple people and don't have to do the groundwork over and over again for every single client. In rural areas, it's more one business, one person, and so you're continually having to spend time and energy developing those relationships. And it can be harder to develop those relationships. There's more time on the ground, more personal context, more one person, one relationship, one job. Another risk in terms of results-based funding in rural areas is a lack of referrals or lack of steady referrals. So in order to overcome some of the risk of results-based funding, you have to have a certain number of clients moving through all the time, so that if you get, say, a bad patch where it's really hard to place a handful of clients, you're still having an income coming in based on other clients that are easier to place. And unfortunately, in rural areas, when there aren't as many clients or a limited number of people coming in the door, it can make it pretty hard for vendors to sustain an area and make it cost effective for themselves. Based on some of the research that we did about vendor scarcity in rural areas, we developed a number of strategies to improve the likelihood that vendors will stay in a rural area or move to serve a rural area. First is to reduce the financial risk that a vendor experiences. So this might include providing incentives for serving rural locations, such as higher rates for each milestone, or maybe providing travel support. There is some strategies that overlap different kinds of funding strategies. So you might pay hourly services and then get some kind of bonus for getting to placement more quickly. So some shared funding models, or providing a guaranteed level of referrals or monthly fixed payments. So first and foremost is strategies to reduce the financial risk to serving rural areas. Another strategy for reducing risk is to improve the probability of reaching a successful employment outcome. And informant interviews revealed a couple of strategies to do this. The first and foremost was to hire rural community insiders with established community connections. So these people knew the business owners and had a personal relationship with them to build job opportunities. Another was to establish payments for non-traditional employment options, such as self-employment or at-home contracts, which essentially expanded the opportunity, the economic opportunity for job seekers. Another area was to lower barriers for provider entry. So first of all, to allow small or independent contractors to serve underserved locations with some waived or loosened requirements. They could waive CARF requirements. They could reduce the number of years of disability experience that was required, just to make it easier for people to enter the game and serve clients on an on-needed basis as those cases came up in rural communities. A few agencies had establishment grants, which helped small scale outfits with startup costs, so helping people overcome some of the costs associated with getting people hired, trained, setting up shop. And then also another lowered barrier was to have the agency sponsor free training for providers so that they are ready to deliver services according to the agency's requirements, but at no additional cost to them. And then the final strategy that I'm going to highlight here is increasing agency capacity and support. So there was expanded agency vendor collaboration, such as the agency helping or sharing with job leads and vice versa, so that there was a more collaborative approach to getting people placed. From a separate story, we examined rural business outreach strategies, and these seem to fit with some of the strategies to improve rural services. So one of the things that we learned about rural areas, and I don't think it's going to come as a huge surprise to anyone, is the importance of personal versus professional relationships. So having a community presence at events, having rural office locations where people are available to talk and share about VR services in their own community, and then building on community insiders as the people who can really make things happen in rural communities. Another thing that was brought up, and it's such an important thing the more rural you get, is the community reputation that is built in the short run will follow you for a long time. It's very important to have a long-term face of VR that is positive in the community so that you can really develop that trust and respect. Part of that is strengthened by the dual customer approach, where the VR agency is actually the human resource expert in rural communities. As we know, the smaller the business, the fewer people dedicated to human resources kinds of issues. And a lot of times small rural businesses are under-equipped or under-experienced supporting people with disabilities, and VR can play a very strong role in assisting them with that. I'm going to spend the rest of my presentation time focusing on self-employment as a very important rural alternative to traditional paid employment. So this chart shows self-employment rates in the U.S. And for the U.S. population, the self-employment rate is 9.4%. For the subpopulation of people with disabilities, it is 11.4%. And for the population of VR consumers, the rate is 2%. So as the data shows, people with disabilities turn to self-employment at higher rates than the general population. But VR closure rates to self-employment are drastically below what you might expect to see among people with disabilities. I want to go to the next slide and show that actually rural areas do turn to self-employment at higher rates than urban areas in terms of the VR population. So this shows that the urban cases, about 1.4% are self-employed, large rural places 3.5%, small rural 3.7%, and isolated rural about 5.2% of those people who are closed to status 26 competitive employment are actually in self-employment. We also know that VR agencies that serve blind and low vision consumers primarily have above average rates of self-employment closures relative to combined and general agencies. We have done quite a bit of work to understand why VR agencies don't utilize self-employment at the rates we might expect. And these things can really be classified into three areas. The first and foremost is that counselors don't feel prepared to assist clients with self-employment exploration. They are not trained in business startup. A lot of times the vendors that they use are not in place to support business development kinds of activities. And there's also confusion about the process within the VR agency. We also heard about concerns that outcomes would not result in viable employment businesses. And what we found when looking at VR case records is that this did not pan out. That if you took the subset of people who were closed to self-employment and compared them to the people who were in competitive employment closures, we found that VR self-employed clients earned comparable wages to to those in competitive employment. They earned significantly higher wages, and they worked significantly fewer hours. So essentially, they were getting more bang for their buck in terms of the hours that they worked and the wages that they received. Counselors also expressed concerns about case costs, that case costs for self-employment would be higher than traditional employment placements, and that did in fact turn out to be true. The costs of purchased services were significantly higher in self-employment cases. I am not sure if that has to do with the caseload and that maybe people that turn to self-employment would be more expensive to serve in the first place. That remains to be explored, but it is a true statement that case costs will generally be higher for a self-employment closure. Using this information as a backdrop, we really wanted to figure out how to address some of the barriers that VR agencies experience regarding self-employment. And this has taken a couple of different formats. Some of our past work has looked at vocational rehabilitation self-employment policies, and our more recent work has focused on a pretty comprehensive self-employment guide for VR counselors and consumers to use while they go through the VR self-employment process. The guide is free for anyone to use, and it can be found at vrselfemployment.org. The guide includes self-guided content. Some of the material is shown in a slideshow format where there's bulleted items, so it's easy for people to follow along with. There are business owner interviews that are the basis of audio and video examples throughout the guide. There's a number of companion materials such as examples, worksheets, accessible versions of all the chapter material, and the site is fully accessible. So before I shift gears and show you some screenshots of the guide just to orient you briefly about it, I just want to highlight the partners involved in developing it. There is Margot Dana from the Utah State Office of Rehabilitation, Dr. Nancy Arnold, who preceded me at the Rural Institute in a variety of self-employment efforts, Jennifer Stevens, who was part of the Small Business Development Center at the University of Montana, then Media Arts, School of Extended and Lifelong Learning, who helped us with the development and look of the site, and then our business owners with disabilities who provided a lot of the content to reinforce some of the messages that are included in the website. So I'm going to the next slide, and this slide is just a screenshot of the main page. The guide includes 8 chapters. The first 3 chapters really relate to self-employment exploration within the VR system, and then the final chapters really turn to a step-by-step guide of developing a business plan. So chapter 1 is focused on understanding the self-employment process in VR. Chapter 2 looks at consumer motivations for becoming self-employed and asks them to do some exercises to consider their readiness to do so. Chapter 3 is focused on a preliminary evaluation of the business idea and whether or not it constitutes a viable business. Chapter 4 provides an overview of the business plan and first steps in the process. And then chapters 5 through 7 lay out the steps for preparing the business plan, including marketing and financial information. And then finally, chapter 8 includes a variety of external resources to help navigate the business planning process that people can access for additional information. This screenshot of the first chapter is meant to highlight where the videos are for each chapter. Business owner views told us about their experiences starting a business with VR. And for each chapter, we include a video focused on that particular chapter content and the business owner's experiences with it. This next slide is meant to show the layout of the website. So within each chapter, there's a focus area that includes the content laid out in tabs, sort of like a file folder. The introduction tab has just a brief overview and allows people to link to PDF accessible versions of all the different examples and content included in that chapter in case they want it for reference as they go through the chapter, or if they don't want to engage the chapter with multiple clicks, etc. This next slide shows a screenshot of what you might see on the Myths tab. It provides a brief overview of myths and realities of starting a business. And then if you see the two little buttons below, these are slideshows about myths and realities and a quiz that people then can further access more information about that topic. If I had pressed the myths and realities button, this is the slideshow that would have shown up. It's 9 slides, and it just goes through a number of different myths and realities related to self-employment. So on this one, the myth is self-employment is my vocational goal, and the reality is self-employment is a way to meet a vocational goal. It is not, however, a profession. And as you can see, there is a audio section at the bottom of that myth that really talks about a business owner's perspective as they entered the program in terms of that vocational goal versus profession content. I also wanted to highlight some of the worksheets that we have available for download on the site. So these ones are worksheets about business feasibility, and they're worksheets that people can download and fill out and return to their counselor if they want to, but it really talks about the basics of starting your business. There's worksheets about your business, there's worksheets about you, and then on the next slide there is actually a worksheet on doing startup costs and how to estimate those. I wish that I could show you some of this information interactively, but for instance, on the startup costs page, the worksheet actually does all the calculations for you. So on table 1, which focuses on materials and supplies, you can type in shelving and the supplier and the units and cost, and it will tally the total costs and also pull that into a worksheet at the very end that actually is a master total of all the different kind of startup costs you might have. So right here we showcase materials and supplies, but there can also be things like licensing costs, inventory, signage, equipment. The list is very comprehensive to really help people get an idea that is accurate in terms of startup costs. Finally, I wanted to show you a couple of additional features of the website. The first is the resources by chapter section. So for every single chapter, we have included all the resources included in that chapter so people can easily access that without going into each chapter if they've forgotten something, to download something, or they want to check back on a specific resource, they can get it there. And then on the next slide, we also have included a variety of additional resources that are not necessarily included in the chapter, but that people can utilize for additional information focused on business development resources, funding resources, some resources directed to veterans and tribal members. If anyone on the call has an interest in self-employment, I really welcome additional input on the resource and would love it if people would look around and see what it has to offer. Our next steps regarding upcoming research on the self-employment guide really is focused on translating it for vocational rehabilitation programs on reservations, so a tribal version, and then also learning how it is used in practice. So we're doing some interviews with counselors and consumers and iteratively updating it based on their input. I want to thank everyone for participating and hanging in with me on this presentation. I want to acknowledge that the research described was all supported by the National Institute on Disability Independent Living and Rehab Research within the Administration on Community Living, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I also want to highlight that I have included references for all of the information covered today, articles regarding the premature exit, state data, telecommunications, rural service delivery, and self-employment projects. So if anyone wants to do further reading, I would love them to check out those resources. And finally, with the time remaining, I have highlighted some discussion topics. What additional barriers deserve attention from your perspective in terms of rural barriers to effective service delivery? And what additional strategies might you share building on some of the conversation that I've provided today?